So what I'll be looking at today is approaches for delivering your data strategy, and looking at the agenda on the next slide. What we'll be covering today is a brief look at the data trends and trends in data and data management. We'll look at some strategies and approaches. And then lastly, some comments on delivery. So moving then on to the data trends, more than most industries, financial institutions have very much been drivers for development in the data and data management worlds. And that's pretty much been the case for probably 100 years or more. And that trend continues. Even today, oftentimes it's the financial institutions that drive data management innovation. And we see that today in the hyperscalers. So looking at the next slide, we have the first of a couple of different slides on overall trends, most of which will be, or many of which will be familiar to people. But it goes without saying that the biggest single trend of all is just the sheer volume of data that's being generated these days. And not only is the volume of data increasing, but the rate of increase is also increasing. So directly or indirectly, volume is the driver for the development of many of the tools and the capabilities that we're seeing today. On the next slide then, the next trend that we've got is the societal change. And the reason that that's particularly important is, especially with COVID-19 and similar sorts of things, we've seen very much that our lives are lived online. All the data is online. Data is increasingly important and prominent in everybody's lives. And as a consequence, it's also becoming an area of attention for regulators and similar sorts of people. And the consequences of any issues in data for the man on the street is much larger than it used to be. And that also drives a change towards seamless privacy and seamless privacy requirements being built into our tools and environments today. Then on the next slide, the second last of our changes are just the overall acceleration that's occurring. So within the data management space, very fast changes occurring. The volume that we've seen drives a trend towards automation and smarter tools. We still have challenges about operationalizing AI. And overall trends then are very much towards automation and towards a management approach that's driven by the volume of the data. And it's also true to say that the management approach these days is driven by the data, and the management approach does not drive the data. And what I mean by that is, 15, 20 years ago, we would have been in a situation where somebody said, well, here's a SQL schema, now go and generate me the data and fit the data into the schema. These days, it's the other way around. It's the data that comes first, and the tools are then driven, and the approaches are then driven by the data. Then on the last of the trends that's worth mentioning is just the ubiquity of the data that we have. Everything these days, I guess, is a truism to say is a data source, and the data can be processed everywhere. So the consequences of that is that both data and processing tends to be movable. And that also encourages a trend towards data fabrics. In other words, ecosystems of related tools and storage mechanisms that just work together. So much less of a focus on individual tools or clusters, much more of a focus on fabrics and ecosystems. So that's a quick sort of run through of the overall trends that are driving the data and the evolution, and some of the consequences we'll have a look at in the coming slides. So the next section then is to look at the strategy. So in this section here, we have a quick look at some of the strategies that are emerging for financial institutions, and we examine in a bit more detail an approach that we've taken ourselves over the last few years in quite a variety of circumstances. So, firstly, to look at the drivers on the next slide. Some of the drivers behind the strategy are the ones listed on the page. So, first of all, we saw in the previous section that the increases very much are driving some of the technology, but also very importantly, regulatory considerations are driving some of the tech in turn. So, the regs follow people's concerns. The regs themselves introduce new requirements, and these days, anyone who's involved in global data management will know that there's hundreds of new standards either out already or in the process of coming out, and most recently now even standards on AI and AI ethics, which are due to be introduced by the EU, for example, early in the new year. So many new requirements on the reg side, and those in turn are driving development of the tech to make sure that those requirements are met. We also know that from a governance point of view, it's almost too expensive not to centralize many of these things. And from a regulatory point of view, similarly, data and data management has to be centralized. Automation becomes key in that process. And two other very interesting new considerations or newish considerations are anonymization, essential to handle people's privacy. And there are a lot of developments also these days on things like anonymous calculation. So, for example, training machine learning algorithms in such a way that the data scientists don't and can't see the data, and the results of the calculation can only be seen by the original owner of the data. And looking at the papers and the announcements, there are some very interesting new developments in those regards. So anonymization continues to be a driver, as also immutability and auditability. And immutability, for example, there are many different facets to that, both from ones that build on prior approaches, like, for example, additions to SQL by temporal databases that give you the ability to time travel just using standard SQL. And then also more interesting new ones, blockchain or DLT-based, like, for example, Amazon's QLDBMS. So on the governance side, a lot of new developments, and overall trends towards automation, anonymization, and centralization of the processes. Looking then at the next slide, this is a approach that's very often used, and it can be used either, we tend to use it either for the enterprise as a whole or individual lines of business, and this is overall for delivering or improving data and data strategy through an organization. Consolidation, it's important by and large to make sure that all data is consolidated centrally, and again it's the cost, a way to reduce costs, a way to ensure consistency of data, and a way to ensure central management of the data. The democratization stage is there to make sure that anybody who needs the data and who is authorized to get the data can get it in a way that suits them. So if you need the data in Excel, you can get the data in Excel. And the cost driver there is to minimize connection costs. The governance is to make sure it's all centralized. A third important step in the evolution towards more sophisticated data and analytics and management is to make sure that there's self-service analytics or self-service capabilities available. It's often overlooked or perhaps not given the importance it's due, but it's an acid test of quality. If you can't do the self-service analytics, the likelihood of being able to do AI and ML throughout the organization is pretty low. So it's a very important litmus test to make sure the data models that you've got and the data models you're managing are good enough, both for business use and for usage throughout the organization. The consequences of some of those things are shown on the next slide. I've listed a couple of just high-level summary case studies. So consolidation on the post-trade processing front, we managed to reduce increase straight-through processing to very high levels for one client. Democratization for another client assisted their whole global analyst team. Trade reporting on self-service analytics reduced the number of fines for one of our clients and also ensured viral growth. And in predictive machine learning for different clients has resulted in very high values of models to individual desks. And some of those have been given numeric values, interestingly enough. So that's a quick view just to try and give some color to the value of each of those individual steps. And then moving into the final section, just a couple of comments on delivery, data management delivery. So how are we doing it by and large, or how are people doing it by and large, and what can we extract as some high level processes and trends? Well, firstly, it's perhaps obvious to say that there's a bigger and bigger chunk of the overall IT estate that's being outsourced. So things are more expensive to govern these days. They are more commoditizable these days. Usually it's cheaper to consolidate centrally, and it moves the management function to a higher level function. Things that would have been taken for granted that would be done in-house, database management, for example, some years ago, now is almost invariably outsourced one way or the other. So the boundary of things that are outsourced is expanding all the time. And you can see that just by looking at the scale of services operated by any of the hyperscalers. However, what's changing is that there's a focus much more on what's insourced as well. And what tends to be insourced very much is anything that has to do with intellectual property. So knowledge and insight and people working with knowledge and insight very much stays inside the organization, and quite strictly so, or more strictly so these days. So overall, the theme there is concentration of knowledge and insight and expansion of the commoditizable infrastructure. On the next slide then, just having a look at what data management delivery these days encompasses. It used to be primarily focused on IT delivery, and IT delivery these days is there are many mature models around. The key differences, though, is that for any project, there's much more focus on the data and the model. And there are different considerations in delivering data management systems and delivering AI, machine learning, and model successfully in a project. So there are different facets to consider. And also, critically, a whole lot more extra reg and compliance delivery that's required. So the overall theme there is that all of those aspects now are critically important parts of data project delivery. And it's not enough just to regard them as a sideline. You go off and ask the DPO for approval at some point in time. It tends to be integrated these days throughout the project and the project as a whole. So overall, the outcome that we're looking for is one framework encompassing all of those aspects. And one project that includes everything as part of the overall delivery. So on the next slide then, we talk a little bit about how it all gets linked together. And there are a number of different ways to do it, but the one thing that's in common across all of them is that we need to be looking at the overall operating model. So the operating model, the changes there tend to be that broader ranges of skills are required in the staff. The processes we've spoken about quite a bit. Generally speaking, all the changes need to be operationalized. Without operationalization, there's no real business value add. And the impact on the different aspects of the operating model are some of the ones listed there. So broader skills and training, integrated processes, much more focus on governance and automation, and centralization of the governance functions across data. So in conclusion, on the slides, before we look at the poll results, the scope of data management is much broader. It reflects broader changes in our industry and society. So data management, once a relatively small part of the overall data picture, is now a critical and front and center part of any financial institution's armory. So with that, I'll conclude and perhaps just if we could have a look at the poll results, that would be interesting. Okay, so on the integrated approach, I think that is more or less aligned with expectations. There are very few people, financial services, people that don't have at least some integration. And it's heartening to see that there's 0% have said that it's not really necessary. Also, it's quite a big evolution to see that people are saying that all the analytics are tightly integrated into the data. So that kind of it's a nice pyramid structure there, and that reflects really, I think, the evolution over the last couple of years and the rapid pace of evolution. Sort of 3-4 years ago, these same questions would have generated less than 5% saying all the analytics are tightly integrated. So it's a testament to the rapid development, I guess, both of the data and the AI and ML spaces. So interesting outcomes, but still quite a lot of work to do from the looks of it. So then looking at the perception of the benefits, a slightly a different sort of a split. So almost everybody is saying either that it's necessary or that it'll improve the key metrics. So most people have moved then from regarding it as a cost of doing business, which would have been the case sort of some years ago, towards regarding it not just as a cost of doing business, but potentially, or at least I hope, a key success factor in the overall delivery of the data management function. So I think this kind of emphasizes the importance of the overall data management process, and I think consolidates the view that we all have, I believe, of the importance of the process and the transformations that we're all undergoing. So on the transformational side, it hasn't, it hasn't improved. Most people are thinking that it's not going to improve let's say all of the metrics, but it'll improve certain of the key ones. And nobody also has listed it as zero benefit. So perhaps as expected, but also an interesting outcome.